There are geopolitical events and things like interest rates that we don't really control, right? I mean, we have some influence on the world stage and so on, but there are other things that you can control. And those things that we can control, in my view, form the biggest part of what went wrong.
Welcome to Colliers Talks, a podcast series featuring the latest trends, insights, research, and developments in commercial real estate in Canada and beyond.
Hello, and welcome to Colliers Talks Economics. I'm your host, Adam. I'm the National Head of Research at Colliers Canada, and I'm thrilled to be joined by a guest I've wanted to have for a while, Richard Lyall, the President CEO of RESCON, as we call it, or the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. So Richard has been around for a while. He's spent decades advocating on behalf of the construction industry and working with developers, policymakers, municipalities, labor groups. You've seen him at conferences, at the real estate forums, all the major issues about housing delivery across our fine province, which has become a even hotter topic than it has been in the past. So through RESCON, he's one of the leading voices in the industry on housing policy, development, approvals, affordability, labor supply, everything. And we'll hopefully touch on all of that today. So we're going to focus on how Ontario's housing market went from one of the hottest development environments ever a couple of years ago to a market where now stalled projects, construction activity keeps dropping, affordability issues. How did we get here? Is it the regulatory side, the government side, the financing side? Is it the presale model, construction costs? We're going to talk about it all. And we're hopefully going to bring a little sunshine, Richard, and see that there's got to be some kind of path out of this to a brighter future for housing, supply, affordability, everything in Ontario. So thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here, Adam. I appreciate the opportunity.
Boom to bust. How did we get here? I remember the good old days of 2022. We couldn't build houses fast enough. The job market was on fire. Financing was easy. Everything was great. Ontario was probably one of the hottest housing and development booms in history. And here we are today, and, projects are canceled and projects are stalled and construction activity is way down. Just from your perspective, you've been looking at this forever. How did we get here?
Well, 2022 for me and for some of my compatriots was actually a pretty scary time because we knew that the rates were artificially low. We were expecting a correction at some point in time. We had the COVID event that was different. But we knew we were headed, for the cliff, right? And I often likened it to a pack of dodos running towards it gleefully. And how we got there was a combination of things. You mentioned some of them. But really the fundamental thing was we really had nobody at the 30,000 foot level looking at all things to do with housing and looking at some pretty fundamental things. And, that's how sometimes, the stories of disasters, they often occur when people are not looking at the thing right in front of them. And the thing right in front of me was the ratio of housing costs to incomes. And it was going worse and worse and worse. And that reflected a whole bunch of problems. In less than a generation, we had this exponential growth in things called development charges, which came out of a thing called, growth pays for growth, which was a clever rebranding of a massive consumer tax, because the consumers ultimately pay for that. Then you had the unadjusted sales taxes on new housing that were always supposed to have been adjusted to inflation, and that didn't happen. And eventually that became a barrier. Then you had we're the most decentralized country in the developed world. And we've got different levels of government. They often don't play well with each other. We got two ministers of housing. They just weren't aligned. And there were all kinds of little, like the creation of, what happened with development charges, for example. It just became a runaway train. I mean, how on earth can a city like Toronto, say they've got this massive affordability problem and then increase development charges 46% in 1 year, which was supposed to be a good deal. It was going to be doubled, but they brought it down to 46%. And of course, that is completely irrational. So When you look at the housing cost to incomes ratio, we went from sort of a historical average of 3 to 4 to 1, and then we got up to like 11 to 1. I mean, Vancouver got to 14 to 1. Vancouver is really the big outlier here. But, no other jurisdiction in North America got to the point where, central Ontario, Ottawa, call it Ontario, and lower mainland BC got with respect to government imposed costs on new housing. So it was just inevitable. We were just bracing for the crash when it was going to come.
That's fair. Although we had been bracing for it. I mean, I feel like in 2017, we were bracing for it. There was concern 5, 6, 10 years ago, and then away it goes. And,
myself, and I won't throw myself into this category, but a bunch of other people that I consider to be way smarter than me were crying wolf for a long time, and it didn't happen. So people, and then as soon as any kind of bubble, as soon as you get that narrative, well, it's just going to go up and up and up, and it's never going to end. And then you see a lot of investors piling in and just buying stuff without even, sight literally unseen. And not just buying one unit, but say a floor of condos, that kind of thing. That's when you've got a problem. And then, of course, rents were going up and up and up. And the worst thing was that the reason why you had, in particular in the condo area, that bubble was because of the restrictions of what we call the missing middle. And then, of course, when it comes to low-rise product, we've been producing the same amount. We were producing the same amount of low-rise product that we were, for years. It wasn't increasing with demand. The demand was there. And of course, that was in complete denial of basic behavioral psychology. If you grow up in a house with a backyard and a barbecue, that's your youth family environment, what that's what you're going to want. And then you had all those funny things where people would, drive to qualify. So, even though with this Greenbelt thing, we created this ex-urban sprawl and, arguably even a worse result for the environment, right?
Yeah, the Greenbelt is like, it's a bill takes a long time to come due. I mean, a sort of, you can understand the logic at the time, but I don't know if it's 03 or 05 or whenever it was set in place. And it's like,
it's 20 years.
We're reckoning a generation later with like, okay, good intentions, but there are like a lot of issues that are falling out from that, right?
Well, that's right. What they did was they imposed all these restrictions on supply, but the trade-off was density. But they did nothing to allow for higher density and more density. And of course, markets work on perception. So the perception was, we got a shortage of land. And it was real too, to a certain extent, not as bad in the beginning, but that does affect land values.
Let me tee you up on your favorite topic, which is like, you've certainly suggested some of these problems they're self-inflicted wounds. They're our own fault. They could have been avoided. Because I think a lot of the focus, we tend to look at the labor market, borrowing costs, or it's, tempting to blame it on, it's because of Trump and NAFTA and tariffs, and that's what's happening. But certainly those economic factors, I mean, they have to play a part. But I think the policy side and the decisions or lack of decisions, or like you were saying, like just lack of coordination, like what's the biggest like self-inflicted wound here where we never had to be in this position in the first place?
Well, when you look at that situation, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are geopolitical events and things like interest rates that we don't really control, right? I mean, we have some influence on the world stage and so on. But there are other things that you can control. And those things that we can control, in my view, form the biggest part of what went wrong. And that's, again, where we just let our costs got out of control. And ultimately, those costs are borne by the consumer. A lot of people, though, don't understand housing economics, much less sometimes even market economics. And we're a market economy, and over 90% of the housing is in the private realm. And so if that market is dysfunctional because of red tape, restrictions, overtaxation, and let's not forget, housing is one of those fundamental economic needs. It's not a want. It is a want for some people, but it's a need no less than food and security. The three fundamental needs, I would argue, in life generally are those three things. And we started treating housing unlike those other two factors, and especially food. I mean, if we taxed food the way we started to tax housing, you would have had riots in the street. And we don't, and for a good reason. But yet, when you equate housing taxes, fees, and levies and where they went, they started to approximate things like alcohol and tobacco, which are, as an economist, they're sin taxes. They're designed to reduce consumption, which is kind of bizarre. But it just happened again because nobody was really paying attention.
Fair enough. But okay, the pushback I sometimes get is, I say the housing market's a basket case, or development's way down, and people say, well, yeah, in Toronto, it's, here we are in Edmonton and it's fine, and we're building multifamily and housing's affordable, and we still have a city and the transit and the job market. So Ontario is uniquely challenged. I know your specialty is Ontario, but I know you also look at like globally or across the country or Texas, California, Florida, whatever. Like, why are we so slow, so expensive? Like, what are we doing wrong, or is it just a victim of circumstance situation?
I think we're the victim of our own sort of innate wealth. I mean, if you think about, I think about Ontario as being one of the best pieces of real estate on the planet. We've got everything. We've got the people. By the way, this isn't a problem with the people. We've got the best people in the world. We've got resources. We've got water. We've got a decent climate. We've got all those things. But for example, if you compare us, and you're right, we've traveled the world. We've looked at all kinds of different things because you have to benchmark yourself against other jurisdictions. If you don't know that, then you really don't know how good you are or not, as the case might be. But like if you line up Alberta with Ontario, last year Alberta had record housing starts, right? We had a record housing failure. So when you line the two jurisdictions up, part of the same country, what's different? Well, the difference came down to, really the housing was a glaring difference. I mean, average incomes in Alberta slightly higher, average GDP per capita in Alberta slightly higher. We had your Minister of Municipal Affairs at our last housing summit, brilliant speaker. And he talked about how housing supply and making sure as best you can that you've got enough housing to support growth and things like that was a number one priority. And they acted accordingly. I think one of the problems we have is that we don't walk, we haven't been walking the talk here for a long time in Ontario. More recently, there's been some very positive changes, and we could talk about that. But
we're trying to unwind our mistakes. Let's say that, right?
Exactly.
The housing market, as you pointed out, is like it's not one market. There's a lot of different. There's the townhouse versus suburban 100%. Single family. But if you open the newspaper or read anything, the condo market, has some troubles right now.
And there's very good reasons for that. Very good reasons for it. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Something that's come up, and I want your view on it, is like there's been, again, when the market's rocking and rolling, nobody cares and everything's fine. But maybe now we're all looking at how dependent the condo market is on the investor and the pre-sale requirement, and you can't finance land and development without pre-sales. And, I think some people are questioning, like, maybe that's not the right model for this environment. Like the investor-driven pre-sale model kind of requires prices to go up. Like why would you buy something that's going to be built 6 years from now unless you were sure you were getting ahead of the market or able to sell it at a higher price? So do you think, like, is something going to fundamentally change? Does it need to fundamentally change at the financing pre-sale level, or will that just even itself out when the market comes back?
Yeah, I think you've touched on something there that's very important. I think the pre-sale market or pre-selling did lend itself to the formation of a bubble in the market. because you had that expectation. And then you remember you got into the assignments, and then there was a business that started on trading assignments, and it just got goofy. I mean, there's still a market for people that say, for example, want to buy we've got the whole waterfront development down there. Somebody wants to buy a condo on the waterfront that they're going to live in. There's always, there's a market for that and other things. But that investor market, that was fed by and partly by that pre-sale process, aided that aberration. And of course, as we know, things funneled into condos because of the restrictions in other areas. It was just a bizarre set of circumstances.
Yeah, and I think they're like rethinking that might be valuable just in terms of it's easy for me to say I'm not a lender. I'm not looking at development projects and all the risk, but I do think like the pre-sale model, like it's going to be very difficult to get there. You need to pre-sell 80% of some downtown condo. To who? There's thousands of downtown condos to buy tomorrow morning. Why do I need to pre-sell one? And it used to be because you can't get one or because it's unique, but that argument is sort of slipped away a little bit, right? Like there might need to be a little rethink there, but that also goes to like, how are the lenders regulated? What is the, office, the superintendent of financial institutions think about that? Like, as you say, the decentralization and the fact that there's 50 different stakeholders involved here is part of the challenge, right?
And one thing that's come out of this, of course, has been a bit of an uptick, of course, in rental housing, which actually, funnily enough, started with when they cut the sales taxes and did the DC moves on rentals that enabled those to pencil. And you've had conversions from condo to rental. I don't see anyone building, unless it's it would have to be a pretty unique set of circumstances to build a condo on spec. Because, as you say, there's still a massive amount of inventory there that, in my view, it'll eventually sell off or get converted. There are some investors looking and buying blocks and stuff like that, but got a long way to go.
We have to get to, there's a whole separate story, right, about CMHC and their unique kind of role here. Like, we deal with the rest of the commercial market mostly, and boy, everybody wishes there was CMHC for office development or building a new mall or something. Like, it's a sort of unique backstop that really, I'm not sure people appreciate how much it facilitates development, even in the downtimes we're in now. Like, we should be thankful it's there, and it's sort of slid these projects over to the rental side where suddenly they can be financed and make sense. Okay, but we have to get to your favorite topic, my favorite topic, development charges. Development charges are front page news. It used to be the kind of thing where you'd go to a conference and people would complain about them, and it's but the average person maybe isn't too plugged into this. Now it's front page news. The government's making big announcements. Mark Carney, Doug Ford. So we have subsidies, we have rebates, we have HST credits. Like, I saw you on social media literally today talking about this, but do you think this is going to materially change things? Like, it's certainly better than nothing, but like, is something like 50% 3-year rebate in development charges, is that going to move the needle, or is it even that isn't enough?
So my answer to that is a firm yes and no.
Okay, please elaborate.
So the first thing is reducing. So development charges and I've been reminded by some mayors that I know and their municipalities, they say, hey, we didn't go crazy with these development charges. And I go, yeah, you're right. But of course, we live in a world of, quick bites and stuff like that. And you can't necessarily lay it all out. But certainly in the central Ontario area, these DCs they got out of control. They were undisciplined. They built up these huge reserves, like City of Toronto had over $3 billion in cash sitting there that they collect. They couldn't spend it fast enough, which for Toronto is pretty hard to do. They're pretty good at spending money. And it wasn't a cheap shot. It's just a fact. But anyways, they, it shouldn't be it's not a subsidy. It's a consumer tax reduction. That said tax went way too high, by any measure. And we did measure it. We did the first report, by the way, on, taxes, fees, and levies on new housing and broke it down and stuff like that. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever said, hey, what are the total taxes, fees, and levies on new housing? And then with respect to the rebate on the sales taxes, they will, and we're going to be, advocating for this, and I think they're going to have to be extended. This 1 year, I think, enhanced thing was kind of goofy Band-Aid stuff. And of course, they're both, like, even the DC thing they've introduced now is kind of a Band-Aid, because what happened was the government set all these huge targets 3-4 years ago. And then it became very apparent that we were going in the opposite direction. And so it's a bit of a panic that we got to turn this around in a hurry. And now to come up with a replacement for the DC system, which is basically coming up with a fair and reasonable formula for growth-related infrastructure supporting housing, a formula of funding for that needs to be devised between the three levels of government. This thing they've got now, and right now what we're hearing is, some municipalities are going to play ball by June 19th as a deadline. Some are like, the timeline's too tight, too much, like, this is too hard. Some municipalities never had the problem in the first place, and some don't even have DCs, a bunch of smaller ones. So it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. I think they went with the shotgun approach to try to jumpstart some stuff. But we'll see what happens. But they did that with the rebate, but then there were no regulations with the rebate. So we're still in that period of confusion right now where someone going to buy a place can say, well, show me in black and white how I get this rebate. And nobody can, right? It's sort of, but it's not a pig in a poke. It's real, if you believe the Minister of Housing.
Well, the announcement's always more exciting than the implementation.
Yeah, exactly. So that's getting sorted out, and we've brought that to their attention. But we've got longer term solutions that need to be arrived at with respect to this stuff. But I don't like the term subsidy, because a subsidy to me is something where you're giving somebody, like, it's like a grant that they arguably weren't really entitled to, but you really need to spur something on. In this case, what happened is the consumer just got crushed, and the consumer in question being, the millennials and the Gen Z. I mean, they got shafted systemically.
Yeah. And I certainly take the view of the government made a lot of big promises about how many houses we're going to build and how we're going to restore affordability. And I don't think it's going that great. So this is sort of a shortcut, let's say, to we're not going to build 500,000 homes a year or any of that. So it's like, let's start to think about what else we can do. Like, okay, we can accept defeat on a few things, but I see these subsidy, again, rebates, whatever we want to call them, cuts, transfers, as a way to say the long-term plan for housing affordability maybe isn't as realistic as we thought, and we need to do something. We can't just wait 20 years for this to play itself out. As you say, there's like a whole generation that's sitting there saying, well, I need to live somewhere. I'm not waiting until I'm 55 for this to solve itself, right?
Yeah, and there are other issues too. Like, there's technocratic issues. For example, compared to other advanced jurisdictions, the ones that are really into PropTech and they've digitized things, we've got 2 to 3 times the amount of government bodies engaged that have their fingers in the approvals pie that other jurisdictions just don't have. So we need to reform how we do things. We need to digitize stuff. We need to use some, and it's there. These aren't, and we have the people that know how to do it here. And we've actually got some innovations here in Canada. It's not, or in Ontario too as well. But we've got to do it. And that's where we fail. I think sometimes, just very quickly, we're really good at policies now, but we're still not good at implementation.
I think many people would agree. Okay, so there's various parts of this whole puzzle. Yeah. We've talked about the government regulation development charge. There's the land side. That's a fundamental side. You need to buy the land for development. And I think land, if you had to look at every part of the real estate world, probably land is the most impacted by the downturn, the higher rates. I think, I always say I can say something positive about almost every area. Retail leasing is strong. Return to office is happening. The industrial market has weathered tariffs, all of that. But land is a really difficult one. And you've said the same, land prices are down. I don't think anyone would disagree. They're down a lot. Shouldn't that help? Shouldn't projects be a little more viable if land prices are down 20%, 40% more? That's a pretty big piece of the puzzle. And if we have DC rebates and the land market's down, how are we still in a place where it's so hard to develop?
There's some good news and bad news here. I mean, I'm surprised that the economy is doing as well as it is. Now, you might say the Iran wars helped our oil industry, which has boosted numbers and whatever else like that. But we're actually doing better than you'd think, certainly listening in the media, you'd think. And I think there's some reasons for that. Certainly land prices have come down, but then that's again, now call me simple, but I look at that ratio of housing cost to incomes again. And so, yes, we've come down. Remember, I mentioned the 11-1. We're down now around 8, 9-1, sort of generally speaking. I'm not talking about Thunder Bay. I love Thunder Bay. Don't get me wrong. But, we've come down, but, our costs are still too high. And that's where these DCs and taxes, fees, and levies, land transfer taxes. I mean, you've got a Toronto land transfer tax, you got a provincial land transfer tax. It's a significant chunk of change. And why? And it's just because it was there and it got taxed. And then you had this idiotic, make the developers pay. Whoever came up with that was brilliant, by the way. It came up with the growth pays for growth stuff and that rebranding of modern methods of construction and some of these other things. Brilliant stuff, but it's baloney. And, so here we are. It's got to come down more. So yes, land prices have come down, but there's other stuff that still has to kick in. And there's some other changes that have happened with planning, zoning, site plan, which are really positive. I mean, they're generational changes, but of course we are where we are right now. So, and people are getting used to it, oh, gee, I can put a fourplex where that single family home once was. I didn't know that, that kind of thing. And that's growing. Multiplexing is really picking up. It's really significant. Missing middle housing, those, I always, and I know you get this, but if people go to Barcelona, they go to Vienna, they go to Copenhagen, they go, oh my God, it's so beautiful here. And then they come home and then someone down the street wants to put up a 4 or 6 story apartment building and the pitchforks and torches come out. It's like the end of the world. And it's sort of, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance that happens here. Like, how can you say that city is so beautiful and we want to do it here, but it's hell on earth now, right? So those things are happening though. We're getting some of that missing middle stuff sorted out, but it's going to take a little bit of time to bite. And then, final point here, I know Carney wants to have he's got this $1 trillion investment idea for Toronto this fall. It's all fantastic. I think we're starting to attract investment again, but we're going to need the housing for it, right? And we're going to need housing supply anyways.
Yeah. And there are all those incremental things. It's hard. We did laneway housing. We did multiplex housing. We did mass timber housing. There have been a lot of small changes. It's hard to see it all add up just yet.
It is. It's because you got to keep track. There's 20 different things there. It's like mass timber. I remember being in London, England, looking at the biggest mass timber wooden apartment building built in the world yet to date. And they said, so what are you guys doing in Ontario? And I thought, here we are, the former colony, the hewers of wood and drawers of water.
Plenty of wood. No shortage of wood in Ontario.
And I said, well, you know what? We can't do this in Ontario. We're not allowed to do it. And the look was mystifying. And then I said, where do you get your wood from? And they said, the United States and Austria. That hurt.
Ouch. Okay, so
yeah,
we talked about all these dimensions of the affordability problems we have. Costs are very high. Like we can look at all of these areas and like it just comes. Okay, government costs are high. That's fair. Taxes are high. Lending, rates haven't come down as much as rates aren't really any lower than they were 2 or 3 years ago. Construction costs were supposed to come down, but then we had the trade war and the oil prices. Okay, maybe land's come down a little bit. Labor is still expensive. Like it feels a little hopeless on the cost side, right? Like something needs to be there.
And I'm going to give you one other cost that's huge. Process. So money loves risk. Investing in anything is all about risk abatement, right? You got to lower your risk, have certainty. So money loves predictability. And I've seen this. So if you can say, I want to build this building and I want to get it through the approvals process and, how long will it take? If somebody can say to you, that'll take 3 years, give or take a month, right? That's different, and then we're talking about a big project here. So you got to sell it, you got to, do, and that's rapid, and that would be great. But, in our market, sometimes you just don't know how long it's going to take. The predictability, you can get blindsided by stuff. And then there's all these chicken and egg games that go on. Well, you got this approval before you get that approval. And then the reports and the piling on. It's kind of like a thing called Parkinson's Law, which was if you create an organization, it will seek to grow. And so with housing, we had so many players that were involved, and they were all pursuing their own mission statements, all seeking to grow, right? And you had mission creep, and then the costs associated with that, and then the delays associated with that. And there's numerous examples I can cite where that just got out of control. We had a Terrion warranty in Ontario, and it ran into problems. The solution to that was to multiply and divide. We created 2 organizations to solve the problem, right? Kept Terrion, but now we took part of Terrion and created a separate organization. That's the kind of stuff that we were doing, and that costs a lot of money. And the unpredictability of it, I've been to other jurisdictions where they have digitized their process, made it very predictable, and it actually had a significant impact on increasing the amount of projects coming forward, because all of a sudden it easier to go to the bank. You go to the bank, you have a certain process. You can say, I want to do this. Here's my pro forma. This is the return on investment. This is the, construction, and it all comes together, right? But, we're not there yet.
It seems like an easier win. Some of this is, like you say, out of our hands, like the global interest rate and oil price environment. Like there's only so much we can do there versus like streamlining process, automation. You would hope some. Okay, now let me turn the finger to you. There is some criticism, you've fielded this for years, I'm sure. We're building the wrong kind of houses. You look at the total number of houses under construction, and maybe it's actually not that low, but shoebox condos, or like you said, look, people, that's great, but people want to live with the backyard. People want space. People want to raise kids. People want parking, whatever. So do you think, is it fair to say there is a mismatch or an imbalance of there's a lot of housing, but the wrong kind of housing? It's too much of what people don't want and not enough of what they do want. Is that fair?
100%. Absolutely. We weren't building the right balance of housing. And I liken markets in some respects, a very simplistic view of it. I used to whitewater kayak. It's like water going down a hill, for example. It'll find its way. It'll go around obstacles. The same thing with housing. We sort of really fed that condo high-rise tower. It's like when people said to me, Oh, we've got over 300 tower cranes in the sky in Toronto. It's absolutely fantastic. That's more than the three biggest cities in the United States. And I said, yeah, and that's a real concern because it doesn't make sense. Yeah, okay, we're doing well, but we're not that good. And we're not one of the major cities in the world, and our housing costs are getting up there. When I see the cost of housing was getting, the same as London and New York, something's wrong. And
yeah, certainly those crane index charts were pretty crazy, mind blowing, like 10 cities in the US combined with 50 million people are way behind Toronto. Like, it just didn't make sense, right?
It didn't make sense. And, we need that low rise housing. We needed that missing middle housing. So, for example, this is how absurd it got, Adam. Somebody came up with it was a good report. Don't get me wrong. It said, hey, we got all these empty bedrooms. You've probably seen the empty bedroom study. Why do we have all these empty bedrooms?
Overhoused.
Well, yeah. And so why weren't these empty nesters selling and moving? Well, gee, they had nowhere to go. Not, you got some that went to, parts unseen and whatever, or San Miguel de Allende. They moved to Nova Scotia or something, which is great. But most of them, they want to stay close to their grandkids and stuff like that. But they had nowhere to go because we weren't building that missing middle product, that nice apartment on a Main Street Avenue corridor that was reasonably scaled, that you had a little retail at the bottom, maybe fruit, vegetable market, coffee shop, that, amenities and, public transit. No, we weren't doing that. We had Danforth Avenue in Toronto, best example. I love it. A subway underground underneath that road for 50 years, and you'd still have 1- and 2-story buildings above it. It was just absurd.
I live in East Toronto.
Oh, you do?
That is a point of discussion, certainly.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, we just weren't producing the right stuff. And then where the water could go, it went into high-rise condos. And by the way, there was a need for small condos. We used to, there were restrictions on that and stuff like that. And if you needed a pied-à-terre in Toronto, a little place, tiny little bachelor, instead of, because you were spending 2 nights a week in Toronto, work-wise or whatever, or you're someone just starting out and you just need a little pad. You're very busy doing all kinds of activities. There's a market for that. But the problem was the market. Remember, I said you had buyers buying sight unseen. They were buying these 1-bedroom apartments, which really or condos, which really weren't 1 bedroom, but they were kind of barely. But they were just buying the 1-bedroom. They weren't really concerned about how big it was or whatever else like that, because the market was going up and up and up, and it turned into a classic bubble.
Agreed. Yeah, I think we have to concede there is some validity to that point of like rock mix of housing. I think it's fair. Okay, there are a couple other topics we have.
Oh, and one other thing too, and just on that note, it wasn't just the industry sort of blindly going along with this. We were actually kind of prevented from doing certain things from a technical point of view. We've got this arbitrary restriction on the size of floor plates in multi-unit buildings. We had these angular plane rules that made no sense at all. Nobody knows really where it came from. And we're still battling the single staircase issue, which just about every other jurisdiction has allowed now for small apartment buildings. They make sense. And, but we're always the last to adopt. It was like, when I battled for mass timber apartment buildings, light timber frame wood apartment buildings. It took years when other jurisdictions were way ahead of us and had figured it out. And we're just so slow to change.
I agree. For our listeners, let me see if I can fill this in correctly, Richard. Angular plane is you can't have a straight up and down mid-rise building. It needs to be terraced backwards, which makes it more expensive, basically, like reduces the number of units. Fair to say, single staircase, there's a requirement for 2 staircases in an apartment for fire safety, I think is the logic. But many places have moved away from that, and it allows more units, better affordability. Fair site.
Well, and bigger units too. The requirement for 2 staircases, given the floor plate restrictions and some other things, and a smaller building actually forced you to design smaller units, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the regulatory.
There's a lot of that, yeah.
Okay, so a couple other topics we haven't got to. Want to talk about? We talked a little bit about tech, labor, immigration. Okay, labor. I find myself sometimes a bit confused. There's the construction slowdown. That means less work for RESCON constituents. Clearly, there's like a slowdown there. And at the same time, you hear stories, and you've heard them for years. We don't have enough. There's a labor shortage. We have skilled labor shortage. There aren't enough trades. There aren't enough plumbers. We need to what are you seeing on the ground? Is it the labor shortage story, or is it the work is drying up and if anything we're oversupplied? I find it confusing as someone outside the development industry to assess.
So we did have a legitimate labor shortage, and we still have some major challenges in our training and apprenticeship system, another systemic problem. Like, for example, we've got a paper that's coming out applying behavioral science and some behavioral economics to this particular topic and what the problem is there. If you go to like Northern Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, I was there twice last year, looking at offsite construction, modular, and so on, but they have the completion rates for their skilled trades apprentices are in the 80 to 90% range. Here, it's 20%. So, but we measure success in training by how many people register as apprentices, but not by how many complete the programs. And if it's 20%, that's pretty crazy. So we have a surplus of labor right now. We've got a lot of people moving into some of the big infrastructure projects. Some have moved out west. My big concern is, and this is where we'll get into the optimistic view, at some point in time here, is that this will all come to pass, and we're going to need a lot of people. And our school system has yet to adjust to incorporate that. If you think of our school, public and secondary school system as a 3-legged stool, you got technical colleges, universities, and skilled trades, for example. That third leg it's basically a piece of straw right now. We eviscerated vocational training. And one of the things we're going to do with this study is look at this from the point of view of the trainee and the point of view of the employer, because they're at both ends of the system, but the system itself is still very suboptimal. We've done a very good job in Ontario and other jurisdictions at now attracting young people into the skilled trades. And said young people we used to blame for being lazy, they don't want to get their hands dirty and all that stuff, which was all nonsense, by the way. That was a systemic failure, blaming the victim, basically, because, we've got a huge amount of young kids that they're visual learners, they're tactile. I've met young people, they want to be stonemasons. I mean, there must be some kind of genetic line back to building the cathedrals in Europe or something. I don't know, but maybe pyramids. But, that's what they want to do. But there was no pathway. And this is one of the big problems. So we're going to have a huge challenge, and it's going to circle. And we relied on immigration to meet our needs. We kind of got away with that for a long, long time. That's not happening anymore. So we've got to really pick up our game on the level of sophistication that we apply to developing young people and serving them. I mean, this is, one thing I loved about Europe, you go and the way they respect for their apprentices over there, that's not really evident here. They respect them because they know they're the next generation. They know that, for example, in factories and plants, that their pensions, to a certain extent, and the future of the company and their own kids, rely on this next generation coming forward. And we need them. And then people started blaming the employers. Well, I said, are these the same employers that are saying we can't get people, and yet you're blaming them for not taking them? Come on, there's something wrong here. And so the system needs a lot of work. But I think that we don't have a shortage now. we are going to have one coming up.
Thanks for clarifying. Okay, so you touched on immigration. That has become a big part of the housing conversation. And I have to say, in our world, it's very challenging. I would say normally underwriting, forecasting, the single most predictable part is demographics. You got your births, you got your deaths, you got your immigration. It's pretty easy to forecast 5, 10, 20 years in the future, except that all broke 5 years ago. We go COVID, lockdown, zero. Then we go all-time record high population growth, unprecedented. That's a problem. Then we go back to negative population growth, which literally has never, ever, ever happened in the history of the country. So, how are people dealing with this right now? Because housing is really the tip of the spear. You can say office and other areas that's more dependent on return to office, the job market, downtown, other things. But housing is just completely tied to demographics, population growth. If there isn't population growth, how do you develop? Or do you just look at this as I guess I look at it partly as this is temporary. There's no way this is going to be the long-term status quo going forward. It's sort of a temporary correction, but how's the demographics and immigration side of the story impacting confidence, development, underwriting, lending, all of that?
So that's a really, really good question. And it's fascinating area. And I think immigration generally has been mismanaged badly. I mean, we're still dealing with issues we had 30 years ago, on problems with respect to immigration and how we score immigrants and recognizing credentials and stuff like that. There are some recent things that are happening. I think it will get better because I think we have a technocrat as a prime minister now who has a lot of non-political experience and some pretty significant qualifications. And he doesn't, when you walk in the door with Prime Minister Carney, my understanding is you better know your file and you better know what you're talking about, or you're gonna be asked to leave. And you won't be asked back. So that's good because
I was going to say, that sounds encouraging, actually. I think I like that.
Yeah, it does. And we've got technocratic challenges where we need technocrats managing the processes. And all too often, I think we've dropped the ball there. And because, some of these challenges, running mass transit systems, look, call it a housing crisis. I call it a growth management crisis because it's more than just housing. I can remember when the federal government doubled immigration, and I looked at this, and I'm a former, by the way, I was a construction worker, but I worked on NAFTA. I was a trade guy, trade policy, trade relations, industrial policy, technology policy. I did some time with an economic development officer in government. And I remember talking to this senior Mandarin, think deputy minister level, saying, I'm just curious, you've doubled immigration. How are you aligning this with healthcare services, with housing supply, education, whatever? And the answer was that they were working on it. And I got it and I appreciated the candor, but, this is not amateur hour, right? And very smart person, don't get me wrong. We've got some really talented bureaucrats and, in the system, as it were, but we've got to manage things better. And when some of the costs of some of the projects and, for example, sidewalk, remember the waterfront, they wanted to build the light rail transit into the waterfront, not rely on, Metrolinx or the city of Toronto because they knew what the problem was. Right. So now that whole thing went kaput, but this is where we need to really get our act together and get things done and do it in a smart way. We've got a learning curve here, but we can do it. And again, we've got the people. It's the public administration of economic development.
I hadn't thought about the Google Smart City. I forgot about that one. That was one of those pre-COVID things I sort of hadn't thought about for a while yet.
I know, that was a crazy thing. So you had Google, they were overconfident. They were, they knew exactly what they wanted, but the problem was that they assumed they were dealing with people who understood what they wanted to do. And then you had the fear factor on the other side, or they're going to be putting microchips in,
Surveillance state.
whatever.
Yeah.
And,
I remember.
and it just, you had this, it was a complete dislocation. And unfortunately, the thing, to my mind, I thought it would have pushed that waterfront development faster than it's happening, because it's fantastic, at the end of the day, when you think of the possibilities there.
Technology. This is always a question I have, which is like, you look at how many industries have been transformed by technology and how much it's changed accounting or banking or all of these. But I sometimes feel like we in real estate are almost like immune to technology. Now, you have mentioned like maybe approvals and automation, but we talk about modular housing and we talk about prefab and we're manufacturing homes, and none of that ever really seems to catch on so much. But like, it probably takes longer to build a house now than it did, I don't know, 50, 70 years ago. Like, that just isn't the case with most other parts of the economy. Like, why hasn't technology had more of an impact? And I don't mean to put you on the spot or be negative about this. It's just like, it's kind of the one area where we talk about how long it takes to build. And it's like everywhere else, we talk about technology speeding up communication and speeding up, transfers of money and all of these other things. But in housing, we're a little bit stuck. Like, why is that?
Well, first, I'm going to say, our industry is actually good at adopting new technologies where they make sense and that kind of thing. And of course, there have been great advances, and we've looked at other jurisdictions and what they're doing in the realm of PropTech and ConTech. I mean, we're using drones and lasers and all kinds of stuff here. One problem we have is we don't measure productivity accurately. And I've talked to economists about this, like CMHC and whatever, and it's, they don't disagree with me, because if you measure something on a per unit basis and you say, okay, that we got this unit here, and then, 10 years later, we're producing the same unit, but it takes twice as long. Does it take twice as long because the people that are making the unit are taking twice as long? Or is there some other question there? And of course, one thing we know, and we did research on this with U of T Engineering, we had a partnership, and we looked at how long does it take large projects to get through the approvals process and whatever. We did a study of 172 tall buildings in Toronto from between 2006 and 16, and it was taking longer and longer and longer and longer to get projects done. But if you're measuring your productivity on a per unit basis, well, your productivity is going to look pretty bad, right? So there's part of that. The other thing, in other jurisdictions, you've had some fairly clever state intervention in coming up with technology mandates. I'm not necessarily an advocate for this, but in other jurisdictions where they've said, well, look, we want social housing, but it's got to be modular. And we'll go to market and order, we want 5,000 units, or, this, we call it the Swedish model. There's that approach. Then there's the other approach where, you take Estonia, where 97% of the interaction between the public and the government is online. And the approvals process. Yeah, Jeff Bezos in Miami the other day said it should take 10 seconds to get a building permit. Theoretically, that is actually possible with an AI format.
I'll take the over, but yeah, it's a fair point. I think, like, surely it should be more automated.
So there's things we can do here, and we've got some PropTech innovation in Toronto. Like, you take, there's some companies that you can go to them and say, hey, I've got this piece of land. What can I do with it? They can give you a report, like, in a few hours, laying out everything you can do with that property. And they can actually then take that and say, hey, if you want to work with us, we'll do the approvals process for you, and it'll only take this long. So there's some innovations there that are taking hold, and I'm really excited about that, especially where I look at a lot of land and properties as being stranded assets, because they're owned by people who they start thinking, well, what can I do with this property? Or I just inherited it or whatever else like that. But that whole world is so complicated. And, how do I navigate all that stuff? And I hear all these stories about, it takes so long to get something approved. And I don't even know what the, property's worth or based on what you can do with it. And so it kind of, if you can make that very transparent and predictable, that'll open up a lot of opportunities. And I think it'll do a lot for the missing middle. And I'm already seeing that effect on multiplexing. You're seeing multiplexing with the planning reforms that have happened, zoning reforms, and some of this technology that's starting to come to bear on what you can do there. And then you can take that to the bank, right? Literally.
That's true. I think there is a lot happening there. It's not visible to the end user, maybe in the same way of like a factory cranking out, shipping container homes or whatever we're like that modular prefab always seems a little difficult. Okay.
I was going to say just quickly on a larger format with large projects, the PropTech and ConTech we have now is really going to radically transform some of that stuff. So you'll get better designs, more accurate designs, more accurate schedules. So this technology is really going to be an aid to our productivity. This is kind of exciting.
I look forward to that. We like to end on an optimistic note. So, Richard, when you come back on this podcast in the 2030s, and we're looking back on this, like, what do you feel optimistic about now? Like, what 5 years from now, what's going to be better? Like, we've talked about all these structural issues, and that there's the macro issues, which are, pretty negative in a lot of ways. Like, and I actually agree with your point that the economy is better, that like the unemployment rate is going down, like affordability is improving. There is like a level of positivity that might surprise people, but at the same time, oil prices, Iran, NAFTA, like there's a lot of negativity too. So like, what's something that gives you optimism? It's a kind of dark time for housing and development. Now it is cyclical, and the bad times follow the good. That's just the way it goes. But when you look to 2031 or something, like what are you feeling is going to be better then?
So we've run some projections, and based on so again, there's the things you can control and things you can't control. On the things you can control, I think a lot of these things are going to continue, like the rebates, tax cuts, reductions in DCs. The digitization of things. These things are going to come because they have to come. It's necessity is going to drive that. And it will, politicians are going to be, facing, the electorate on the basis of, well, what have you done to fix the housing crisis? Because we're not seeing it. So that is driving that. And we know that housing, and we've done a lot of work. We did this on infrastructure too. Years ago, we started, because we knew government was dealing with infrastructure property, we started producing the reports. Housing is top 3 issue, right? As it should be, because shelter is so important to health, well-being, educational outcomes, you name it. So that is really going to, I think, explode. And the PropTech and ConTech is going to be amazing. And I think it's going to be really positive. I think some of, people talk about robots and job sites. The robots we'll have on job sites are the ones like, who wants to rake asphalt and who wants to go into a sewer tunnel? Right? We're going to stop doing, we're not going to put people into places like that, those high risk jobs. That's a good thing. And I think a lot of this innovation is really going to open the door up to opportunities. It's going to unlock land that you can now, as a consumer, by this time next year, if you own a piece of land, you can go online. You can probably do it now. With some of these companies, you can for sure. But you'll be able to find exactly what you can do with that property, what's possible, what's not. It'll spit out designs at you. It'll tell you how long, kind of financing, or whatever you need. It's going to unlock huge opportunities. Now, having said all that, can't explain Washington, D.C., right? But I think that too will come to pass, because I do have faith in our neighbor to the south that, there was reasons why they got to the point where they're at now, but I think this will pass. It might not be easy and whatever, but I think it will. And I think that there was a great piece in the Atlantic Monthly I saw. It was a letter of thanks to Donald Trump saying, hey, we really appreciate all the things you're doing because it's forcing change. It's forcing us to, the Europeans, their own defense, Canada to stop. I've often said, and I've dealt with international groups, and I was the president and chair of an international organization, and which was a lot of Americans and great friends and stuff like that. But I've always said to people, we've got the best neighbor that you could ask for. Whenever there's a crisis in the world, the Americans were always the first to show up. I mean, okay, they've got aircraft carriers but they were, very generous and always there. And let's hope that never changes, right? Because if something really fundamental changes there, we've got a big problem. And we relied on them for certain things. It's kind of like I think this is a growing up for our country, which is good. And to compete with the Americans, because if you look at the last 10 years, and this, I mean, we used to track with the U.S. on a whole bunch of measures, and then we ended up with this K chart.
Yeah, losing the productivity battle and the investment battle and all of that. Yeah, certainly,
100%. So I think we talk about this in 5 years, we're going to be having a different, and I think 5 years we're going to be well into a recovery. I think it's going to happen faster. As in economics, bubbles go up higher than people thought, crash harder and farther than people thought, and take longer to come out of it. I think we're going to come out of this faster. Certainly 2027, 2028 are going to be really tough. But, we've got low-rise sales right now, even with this half-baked DC stuff, it hasn't quite been figured out yet. There's a market there, and there's a market for these condos at the right price, right? Mm-hmm. So, we can see this happening already. And Mike Moffat had a report. I haven't looked at it. I don't know if you've seen it, Adam, but I caught it on social media. He's saying, don't worry about the demographics. And I think one reason there is that we've always had more people here than the governments like to admit. And I think that there is latent demand there for example, low-rise housing and stuff like that. And the one thing I'll leave you with, of course, is that on this note, one thing that, I've talked to the feds about this, the housing situation is different in different parts of Canada. People forget that. So it's made it a little harder for the feds to get involved. And, but I think we're getting there. And I'm very optimistic about the future. And that's why I think we're going to get back into that labor supply problem again, because we need people to build. The robots aren't taking that over.
Yeah. And when we look at the forecasts from our macro vendors, it's generally improvement is not a better job market, a better interest rate, borrowing cost environment. The forecast is not necessarily that those things get worse. If anything, they're probably better 2, 3, 5 years from now than they we're weathering a pretty big storm right now. I would agree with that. Okay. Thank you, Richard. You've been generous with your time. Thank you for joining us. We talked about the Ontario housing market, development, economics, government policy, labor, demographics, what's coming in the future, tech. So it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you. Thank you to everyone listening and watching this latest episode of Colliers Talks, and we appreciate your time. We hope this episode gave you something practical, something thought-provoking, something that can help you in your decision-making in your day-to-day work. So be sure to join us next time for more insights and conversations. Until then, take care.
Thanks for listening to Colliers Talks podcast. To learn more about Colliers Canada, our experts, and our solutions, visit collierscanada.com. or find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook.